When Jesus came on the scene, he came into a very dark world. In a world filled with pain, filled with a lot of anxiety on the part of a lot of people. It was a world that we can scarcely even comprehend. A world without aspirin. A world without any of our conveniences. A world of constant pain for some. Emotional, physical, even spiritual. And yet when he came on the scene, he didn't come to bring a new religion. He came to bring a new humanity. He came to bring a message that would make people different. And he was calling us to be a part of this group that would be set aside from the world, that through him would demonstrate love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. He was the message in that he demonstrated these things in the way that he lived, but he was also calling people to be his disciples, to live in that same manner. At the end of the book of Matthew, we see a passage that we very often call the Great Commission. It was Jesus speaking to his disciples and said, "Now all authority has been given to me. Go now into all the world and make disciples." But I think there is another very small passage in Matthew 5. It's a part of the Sermon on the Mount that may have been the beginning of this Great Commission. Because as he was calling people to be followers, he was commissioning them to live in a different way. I'm going to read to you this morning from Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16. And I'd like you to understand that this is, in fact, a commission from the Christ himself, as he is speaking to us who want to be his disciples. And he's calling us to a new way of life. Out of respect for this scripture, please stand and listen to the commission that Jesus is giving to us. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. I want to tell you that one of the greatest blessings of my whole ministry has been able to work with Ryan. And he has grown in such enormous, powerful ways that we are all blessed by him. And hopefully, we're getting ready to even expand this staff around here. And we're very excited about some wonderful things happening. We sang "This Little Light of Mine." Kid song, right? Right? Kid song carrying with it the message that Jesus gave us in that commission that I just read. That we are to be the light of the world. We are the salt of the earth. We are to be the ones who demonstrate this new humanity, this new way of living. He never had in mind that we would just be a religious group. As a matter of fact, several places in Isaiah and in Jeremiah, God expressed his utter disgust with religion. Now that sounds strange, But for the most part, religion, as we look at it, is a man-made deal. True religion, James tells us, is when we care for people. But Jesus was calling us to be a demonstration in the way that we live, to be an answer to the darkness of the world. And let's talk about that this morning. We live in a very dark world. We live in a world that's filled with fear. Many are confused, and few of us know even what to do about it. Today, we're going to talk about our responsibility as Christians in this very dark world. I want to remind you that Israel itself, God's chosen nation, had some very dark times. When we first see them as a nation, it is actually in that time of captivity in Egypt. They went in as a family of 75, but they came out as a nation, estimated maybe 2.5 million people. They had always been God's chosen people, and yet He was taking them through the darkness of captivity at that time. They lived under the strenuous demands of being slaves in Egypt. Life was not easy. They lived in captivity. They lived in fear. They lived in pain. And then Moses came along by God's commission and led them out. I think it's going to be in January and February. I'm going to do a series of lessons that all come out of the book of Exodus, because I think there are some parallels of what's going on in Exodus to our lives today. But in my preparation for that even now, I've been looking at what an amazing moment it was when they came out. They crossed through the Red Sea, and then they stood looking at the desert. And what a foreboding place that was. No water, no food, no path to follow, nothing except desert. And here they are. They couldn't go back, but they were afraid to go forward. Even then was a time of anxiety. While they were in the desert, they faced all sorts of problems, including an enemy that came to destroy them. They faced the Amalekites, dark times. They came up to that point that they could have gone into the promised land, and yet because of some persuasive, negative people, they were persuaded that they could not go into the promised land. And I want you to think, and by the way, when I get to this particular lesson in January or February, I want you to pretend like you never heard it before, but I'm going to tell you right now, okay? But when they faced that opportunity to go in and then declined that opportunity, can you imagine what the mindset was? What now? They'd left Egypt to go to the promised land, and now they can't go to the promised land. They couldn't go back. They couldn't go forward. They were without hope. It left them no place to go, filled with fear, and filled with the reality that they had said no to God. There came that time that they got to enter into the promised land. Indeed, it was a happy time, but it was also a time of great anxiety. They, an ill-equipped people to fight an army, went to clear out an entire area of Palestine. How were they going to do that? They faced dark days. Later on in Old Testament history, there was that moment when God's kingdom divided, fought against itself and divided. dark days. There were those very dark days when the Assyrians came in and conquered Israel, and the Babylonians came in and conquered Judah and carried them off into captivity in incredibly dark days, days of hopelessness, again, days of captivity and days of pain. Israel, God's chosen people, faced the world as a very dark place. The point is that life is hard. For everybody, life is hard. Sometimes more than others. But occasionally Israel, as we look back at Israel, there is a lesson for us that begins to show a little bit of light. And we see it, I think, one of the wonderful places we see it in a passage that's very familiar to many of us. We see it back in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk, this is the point of this passage right now for us, and even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. In the darkness of the world, there is the promise of the presence of God. It was so for them, and it is so for us. Have you noticed how dark things are right now? Let me talk about some very negative things for a few minutes. During the last month, we've seen some terrible things go on. We are made aware of the fact that there is a very powerful force in the world that is bent on destruction. The numbers tell us that in the world today there are about 1 billion people who identify themselves as Muslims. The people who inquire into these things and do the research tell us that somewhere between 15 and 25% of those people are what we would call radicalized. Here's what that means. There are 200 million people in the world who want to destroy our nation. They want to destroy the Western way of culture, and they want to destroy Christianity. Now, I know, and I've heard the talk, and you've heard the talk, the politically correct thing to say right now is no, Islam is a peaceful nation. It's a peaceful religion. And we should respect that. And it's just a very small group who are really that radicalized. Well, you know what? I wish that the people that would say that would do their homework. Because the 200 million people I'm talking about here are indeed very focused on our destruction. And yet, the people who surround them, if we look at different nations, what we're seeing is that in most nations, the percentage of people who support them is between 70 and 90% of those nations give their backing to the radicalized ideas. If you want to talk about Islam more and it being a peaceful nation, come talk to me. But bring your Quran with you and I'll show you some surahs in their verses that say, no, we're not bent on peace. We're bent on destruction of anyone who opposes us. Christians are being crucified and being beheaded just because they are Christians. In the last month, we have seen a Russian airliner brought down by a bomb. We've seen bombings in Beirut. We've seen the catastrophe that took place in Paris. And just this weekend, there are promises that have been sent out through media, through social media, promises from the terrorists that they are ready to attack New York City, and they have promised to burn the White House. Just a few days ago, in Mali, a Western African country, there was yet another assault on a hotel where a lot of foreigners were staying, and 19 or 20 were killed there. And even today, this day, the 22nd of November, today, the country of Belgium is on the highest level of alert. They've closed all their subways. They've encouraged everyone to stay home, to stay out of the restaurants, to stay away from any public gatherings because it's just too dangerous. And they say that they are a peaceful religion. I am not here to accuse all Muslims of being haters. I would encourage people to read their literature. But the point of my even bringing this up today is simply to point out that we live in a very dark world. And the world that surrounds us right now can be very negative. I know that there are probably there's a certain percentage of people who, when these things happen, are deeply affected. As we were affected after 9/11, people are deeply affected right now. Some are afraid because we live in such a dark world. And the question's being answered, what can we do about this? Because it seems like there is no answer. What should we do? There are some that say, well, we ought to go bomb them. Well, really? Really? Who are you going to bomb? And where? And are you going to bomb a few people over here? And what's that going to do to the people that are surrounding the globe of the same mindset? It's not going to solve anything. There are those that say we need to go negotiate, and yet that's proven to be useless because that side is not interested in negotiation. And then all of this, we talk about all of the darkness that's in the news. Let's step away from that for a minute and talk about your darkness. Because I know that people within this auditorium right now, there's a lot of people living in some darkness. There are people who live in constant pain. There are people who are broken by grief. There are people who are in a relationship situation now that is just tearing them apart. There are people who are bewildered and afraid financially. There's all sorts of personal darkness that goes on. And we look at all the darkness, and the world seems dark, and there doesn't seem to be an answer. And we look at our own situations, and we don't seem to have an answer. And we want to scream, I don't know what to do. And at that point, God says, good. You're right where you need to be. If we think we can solve the problems, then we're going to try to solve our problems. But occasionally, it's a good, healthy thing for us to get to the point that we understand that all the darkness is not going to be conquered by my wisdom or your wisdom or by our cleverness or by our plans. Sometimes there are things that are going on that are so big and so dark that they can only be addressed by the mighty hand of God. And I believe that may be where we are. I want to remind you of what kind of conditions were present in the New Testament. As the message of Christ entered into the city of Rome, this city that was certainly engulfed in its own myths and its own religion and traditions and its own political chaos. And yet the message of Christ came in, and those who attached themselves to that, who were bold enough to call themselves Christians in that setting, came under immense persecution. And in the centuries that would follow, the 2-3 centuries that would follow that, many people would die in the city of Rome simply because they were Christians. It was a dark place and a dark time for people of Christian faith. And yet, knowing the darkness of the hour, Paul, the apostle, wrote to them, and he wanted to remind them, he said, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love the Lord, to those who are called according to his purpose. Later on, we would read about Paul and his own personal struggles, because Paul, the apostle, had his own dark hours. And there were times that he was lonely, and there were times that he was broken, and there were a lot of times that he by himself simply didn't have the answer. And he himself lived evidently in constant physical turmoil. Whatever that thorn in the flesh was, he had a physical problem. And he didn't know what to do about it. And it's at that point that he took it to God and he said, please take this away from me. I can hear that reasoning, and boy, can he build a case. He could say, Lord, look at all the good things I can do. If you can just make me well, just get me well, God, and I can do all this for you. And God said back to him, my grace is enough. What? Paul wanted to be healed. And yet God said, you know, there's something bigger in this than your health. God says to him in the course of this conversation that Paul's greatest personal strength would be demonstrated in his own personal weakness. And so when we face our darkest time, and when the world faces its darkest time, then is the moment for us as Christians to be able to be the light of the world. I want to remind you that there were several places in Scripture that situations were presented to God, and God himself said, is anything too difficult for me? And with that, the hearers of that message in each case had to be utterly silenced. When God is present, there are answers. We need to understand that this is not about us. It is about God in his greatest plan. Is Islam going to override God? No. Is the God of Islam the God of Christianity? Be careful. The God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Ishmael? Sounds like the same God, but a drastically different understanding. And the reason that we have a different understanding is because we learn about that God from a different source. And the source from which we learn about that God, we know as the Bible. And we will take our Scripture, and we will let it stand up against the Quran and against any other of the traditions and literature of the Islamic world. And the Bible proves to be not even close in its power. Are we going to be overcome? Is our faith going to be destroyed by this dark world? It is not. As a matter of fact, the darker the world gets, the more opportunity there is for our faith to shine. Maybe we need to start with the idea that's expressed in Psalm 131. In the very first verse of that psalm, it says, O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor my eyes haughty, nor do I involve myself in great matters or in things too difficult for me. Christians, you wonder what to do about the dark world? Let me just say this from the beginning. You are not going to come up with a solution to Islam. You are not going to solve the problem of the refugees. None of us by ourselves is able to face all of these great big issues. And those great big issues, they will be resolved. But I don't need to lay in my bed at night and worry about them. Because the darkness of the world is a great big thing that none of us by ourselves can conquer. And we're not asked to. We don't have to worry about it. So what are we supposed to do? The question remains, what should we as Christians, how should we react to such a dark world? Let me give you just a few hints. Generally speaking, let me just say, God is aware of you and your own darkness. And He's standing with you in darkness. He's holding your hand in your darkness. I remember a time, hadn't thought about this until just now. Remember a time when I was about, I must have been about 8, 9. And my dad and my brother took me with them as they went out one night. They wanted to go hunting coyotes. We didn't see any coyotes. We didn't hear any coyotes. But what we did do was we went out in the woods. And you want to talk about dark? Let me tell you, there are places in the Colorado mountains when you get away from the cities that it's dark. It is so dark you cannot see your hand in front of your face. And we went out to such a place and we turned out all the lights. And we had one of those dying rabbit calls. If you know what that is, you know what that is. If you don't know what that is, let me just tell you, it's the creepiest sound you ever heard in your life. It's scary because it sounds like screaming. And my dad started blowing on that thing. Scared me to death. But everything was okay because I had my hands wrapped around my daddy. Christians, that's where we start. In the darkness of this world, let's wrap our hands around our Father. And then He's given us some specific instructions. Let's start with this. From Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, I simply say this: in your own faith, stand firm. Put on the full armor of God so that you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Stand firm. In your faith, make your faith stronger. Delve into your faith. Study your faith. Pray about your faith. Build your faith. Stand firm in your faith. Start with that point. And especially, I say this, in your own personal darkness, do not let yourself be absorbed in your darkness. Rather, let yourself be absorbed in the light of your faith. Stand firm in your faith. Secondly, and this is contrary to political correctness right now. I don't know if political correctness is the right phrase for this. Right now, we see in the world all sorts of answers that seem to be very violent. Jesus, in calling us to Himself, has some instruction. I would read to you from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, because He is giving us some instruction here that I didn't put a place mark for, okay? But listen to this. This is an answer to the world. If I speak with the tongues of men and angels and do not have love, I become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. Put this in a different context. If I know everything there is to know, and I'm just smartest guy around, and I'm the most powerful guy around, but if I don't love, I'm still standing in the darkness. If I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Because love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. Love is not brag. It is not arrogant. It does not act unbecomingly. It is not provoked. It does not take into account a wrong suffered. It does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. Bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Endures all things. Love. The powerful tool in our hand is to be able to look the world in the eye in all of its darkness and in all of its intimidation and say, world, I will not be intimidated by you because the love that is in me is greater than the hate that is in you. We are called to be people who love. Number 3, we're called to trust in God. I skipped a passage. I want to go back. No, I'll go on for the sake of time. Let's trust God. I mean, really trust Him. Not just lip service. Let's really trust Him. We're facing a world that we don't have answers to. But our God is mighty, and so we trust Him. And we hear Him say things like in Jeremiah 32. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah saying, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too difficult for me? No. Is God big enough to take care of your darkness? He is. Trust God. Number 4, we need to pursue God's justice. In Proverbs chapter 21, verse 15, it says this, the exercise of justice is joy for the righteous, but is terror to the workers of iniquity. The world wants to intimidate us with its physical terror. In fact, we intimidate the terrorists with the idea of perfect, God-given justice. Did you know that in the Old Testament, there are a couple of words that are used for different meanings here? But there is one word that means both justice and righteousness. Same word. What this means is that our mighty God, as powerful as He is also a good God. And He will mete out perfect justice. We don't have to try to get even with our enemies. We don't have to, on our personal level, we don't have to get our revenge. We don't have to do any of that because God will bring perfect justice. If you look at all the unrighteousness in the world, understand that God's going to address that. Whatever sin there is that we continue to practice, well, God's going to address that too. But as Christians, we don't have to fear that because all we have to do is take that back to Him and He will justify us. Number 5, we need to seek peace. 1 Peter chapter 3. This is a good summary of the Christian life. And as we stand in the midst of a very dark world, Peter would write to us and say, to sum up, he's speaking to Christians, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. And then he quotes here from the Old Testament. For the one who desires life, to love, and to see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and His ears attend to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. We seek peace. God will take care of justice. And then we have the passage that I started with as our 6th thing and final thing. As Christians, we're to live above the darkness. I wish I could speak to every situation, whatever darkness surrounds you right now, live above it. Do not be absorbed or identified by your darkness. Do not let your darkness take control of your life. Live above the darkness. Be the salt of the earth. Be in this very dark world. Be the light. Live above the darkness. Many have misused a passage that I want to close with because they have misapplied its time setting in many ways. But in the 24th chapter of the book of Matthew, Jesus is speaking, and he's actually at the beginning of speaking about some end time situations. But before he gets to talking really about the end of the world, he's talking about the darkness that the people there at that time are facing. And he gives us kind of an overview of what the Christian life is going to be like actually through the coming centuries, because he's looking at what Christians are going to have to bear. And he says to Christians, those who would follow him, what they're going to have to live up to. Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you're not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and will hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." You, Christian, you, individual disciple of Jesus Christ, you are the light of the world. And as we live in this world that just increasingly seems to pour on us more and more darkness, we do not have to be intimidated by that. We do not have to be afraid, because greater is he who lives in us than he who lives in the world. And he has called us not to be a part of the darkness, but to be a light. And one small light in the midst of great darkness can be seen for miles. How powerful is it if collectively we are the light? The world needs to see light. And Christian, that's who we are. We have not been put in this world right now to suffer in the darkness of the world. We are here right now to live above the darkness and to be a people who are the light, and to live in such a way that we give hope to others. Yes, there is this international thing that's going on right now. It's bewildering to us, and we don't know what to do. Fine. Let's just put it in God's hands. But more immediately, for each of us, there is our own personal darkness. Let's put that in God's hands too. Some of you right now are so surrounded by the darkness that you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. Wrap your hands, wrap your arms around that loving Father, and understand that he has called you to be a Christian, a Christ-like person. Live above the darkness. Put Christ first, and the darkness dissipates, because the darkness cannot compete with the light of God. if we can help you in your darkness right now, come, let's stand and pray.